Hello, everyone. Welcome, and thank you for joining us. My name is Yusra Shibeka. I'm an educator. I was an English teacher. I now host a podcast with my lovely friend sitting in the audience. Our podcast is called Why with Haya and Yusra. We discuss educational topics and the educational process, but rather than focusing on markers and whiteboards, we like to focus on the human aspect of things. The relationship between student and teacher, the traumas that happen in school, all the things that are mental. And that's why this specific session is dear to our hearts. With us today are three amazing people who are not teachers, but they have helped the educational process greatly. First, we have Gizem Konuş. She is from Maya Vavka, a Turkish organization that helps the youth that have been through trauma. So whether it's natural disasters or familial trauma or something like that. She is a clinical psychologist. She has worked with numerous people over the past few years. Second, we have Greta. She is the co-founder of this amazing thing called Recipes of Wellbeing. It's an organization that focuses on change makers and shifting that culture and really focusing on people's well-being. They have a lovely website where you can see their recipes of things you can do for your well-being. The third speaker who is joining us remotely will be Shunta. Hi. Shunta is a policy analyst at OECD. A policy analyst is someone who helps develop and assist in the creation of policies. So his focus is on the youth and their work welfare. So welcome. And I'll start by telling everybody that we have a live discussion that you can send your questions throughout the session, and I will be directing them to our speakers. And there's also a poll on the same portal. So on the WISE portal itself, there's the live discussion where you can ask the questions and you can answer the poll there. So let's start our lovely discussion. It's centered around well-being and being healthy and dealing with mental health issues. And a lot of the youth, we don't really have to define the age group, but it's somewhere between 5 and 35, let's say. Just young people have been through drastic changes in their lives. And in turn, that affected their mental well-being and their mental health. So, Gizem, I would like to ask you first, how would you describe the change that has happened before the lockdown and pandemic and now?
Yes, thank you again. With the switch to online education with pandemic, at the beginning, we assumed that the school which constitutes the whole life of children and all young people. Yes, at the beginning, it's tried to seem like a school, we know.
Yeah.
But with time, we saw that school, online school couldn't be
it's not the same.
It's real school.
Yeah.
Yes, and home couldn't be a school like before. Because the school is just not a physical building, it's a climate. I think school climate and all stakeholders of school climate who are teachers, psychological counselors, education personnel, and also caregivers are a climate and it's a vein through which social life flows for children and young people. And the need for live interaction, the need for movement, the need for support each other physically, the lack of it. So yes, we tried to adapt a new system, new education system, new online system, and I think in these extraordinary circumstances, we did our best because we used all our internal and external sources. And I think it was okay because I think we should it should be an approach. Yes, it wasn't perfect, but it was good enough. And I think all of us as caregivers, teachers, psychological counselors got the feeling of, yes, it hadn't be perfect, but it just should be, and it can be good and enough.
Would you say that the mental issues that the youth were facing before the pandemic, like depression, anxiety, all of these things, etc., do you think they have amplified so they became greater, or do you think it shifted?
Yeah.
Something changed?
But how? Yes, most of us live as we don't know any other potential what we have for some psychological disorders. Pandemic periods and all, I think it's almost 2 years. This pandemic period triggered some underlying issues, some underlying potential problems arise during the pandemic. For example, if I say, Yok, no, I don't have a social phobia, maybe it triggered. And some sleeping problems, emotion regulation problems, anger management problems, or family conflicts, or some childhood traumas arise on the surface, but they were sleeping before the pandemic.
Yeah.
So both individual applications and with the family, with the holistic applications we got during our services as Maya Vakfı Foundation. And as Maya Vakfı Foundation, before pandemic, we were working trauma, because we represent a trauma-informed approach as Maya Vakfı Foundation all over the world in our all studies, individual or community-based studies. But trauma changed itself, its version during pandemic, because it is a social trauma. It seems like individual, but it just triggered the individual things behind the scan, but it's a collectivist trauma. So, as you said, anxiety, depression, social phobias, some childhood traumas triggered during the pandemic.
A lot of people would argue that with the pandemic and lockdown, now kids aren't bullying each other. They're not pushing each other in hallways in schools.
Good point. Yes, there were always bullying at schools.
Yeah.
And we were also working against and campaigning against bullying, peer bullying at schools. And it's also changed its version. I think
That's
it's
what I
converted to
was going to
cyberbullying,
ask,
maybe.
yeah.
Because yes, the children were on the screen, just looking at the screen, but there is something different. Something different began on the screen.
Yeah.
That's called cyberbullying.
Yes.
And there is a population, a different population. I want to emphasize about them. Some pandemic is a benefit for some of them, but pandemic is at the same time a handicap for some students, because some students believe that they can learn at the school environment better. They can interact each other in the school climate. But for some of them who were bullied at school, they consider as a chance the pandemic, because they are not bullying at home.
Yes, now they are protected.
They are protected. This is one group. Yani the bullied group, the bullied population can consider pandemic as a chance, because they are protected from the children who bullied them. But another group like that, the children with social anxiety, or the young people with social anxiety felt more comfortable at home. Because when they are in a session, or in an education session, or in a group session, they don't have an anxiety or a fearful effect for the people, because they feel like he's alone or she is alone. But maybe there are hundreds of people there, but the effect is really different.
Yeah. You were bringing up a great point of some groups were experiencing the pandemic differently. I would also like to speak about vulnerable groups. So people that were going through the trauma that you were handling before the pandemic. People who, people with immigration issues, familial issues, any sort of trauma. People who did not have access to school or online learning. How would you say lockdown or the pandemic has affected them?
at some point, dramatically, of course, negatively affected, but especially in disadvantaged areas, in rural areas, where they could have limited chance to reach a psychologist or psychiatrist, they were affected more, of course. Or the regions where some psychological disorders are stigmatized, they are also vulnerable groups for us because they have no contact with a psychologist or with a psychiatrist. The solution was that online psychological mental health service for such kind of groups. We tried to reach as many as people we can reach. We both supported them with individual therapies and both group therapies or some PSS sessions, which is psychosocial sessions, which is combining all together caregivers and children and teachers together. And you can consider this kind of group sessions as a focus group discussion, and some problems arise together, and again together they can find some solutions for such kind of problems in the school climate.
Have you worked with cases where domestic violence, let's say, for example, have increased during lockdown? Because people are now staying at home, they're staying together, people who are already facing domestic violence. Have you dealt with such cases, and what can be done in a similar situation? So how can people help? How can people change that?
This kind of fragile and vulnerable cases are really important and more important for us because at that point, not only mental health services requires, but also we need child protection side. Yes. So as Maya Vakfı, in all situations, in such kind of crisis situations, we always take support from the child protection because, it's a different discipline and important discipline. When we recognize, when we identify such kind of a case, which is a possibility to be abused, to be harassed, or to be a family conflict, like psychological or physical injury, maybe. Yeah. This can be considered, yes, with a mental health perspective and support, but also with some steps with child protection discipline. And we combine the two disciplines for
We'll definitely
such kind of
be talking about what steps can be taken as a society, as individuals, as policymakers. We'll be talking about that during the end. But now, Greta, I would like to ask you, can you tell us more a little bit about the recipes of well-being?
Yes, and welcome everyone. Really nice to see you. And hello, Shunta, as well. Yes, I mean, the idea of recipes for well-being really came from the realization that there's many change makers. And by change makers, we could consider traditional activists, social innovators, teachers, community leaders, who are doing incredible work, and this work sometimes actually takes a huge toll on their well-being, not just mental, but also physical, emotional, spiritual well-being. And so we said, how is it possible that you have all these people doing this incredible work with this energy, with this passion, and they're so exhausted, so drained, especially young people? Because very often they don't have then the financial means to support each other. They're early in their journey, so there's a lot of passion, but not enough support. And we said, okay, what can we do to actually make well-being more accessible and also more fun? And that's how we created recipes for well-being. So we have this website as well with loads of activities for well-being. So not food recipes. We do have people who write to us, I can contribute some, food recipes from my country. We're like,
That's not what we're talking about.
Exactly. But the idea is to really use the food metaphor, which is something that can nourish us, right? So food is nourishment. It can really help us to grow and to stay healthy. But also we share food, that is so important in so many cultures. And the idea that well-being is also shared, is something collective and community-based. And so that's how we try to make well-being more accessible through these activities to foster individual, but also team well-being at the mental, spiritual, physical, emotional level, but also looking at digital well-being, which is, with the pandemic increased massively, and many people realized they don't have the tools to actually navigate the digital world in a healthy way. So that's how it started and why.
Do you work with a specific age group or?
That's always a tricky question, right? What is a young person? I would say that mostly we focus on 18 to 35, but then, I would say that the recipes are there for anyone, right? They're, I would say, intergenerational. So we really try to focus on young people, but it goes beyond. So it's really looking at how can you live well, but also sustain your work in a way that it can be more effective. So it's kind of finding that balance between inner and outer work and see how the two of them actually feed each other. If you only focus on your outer work and not on your inner work, you're probably not, something is not right. If you only focus on your inner work, then what about the rest? Because again, we don't live isolated from each other. We're always connected.
We're together, yes.
yes.
We definitely do live in a community where I personally believe that everyone is connected and everyone does have a responsibility in well-being. And while we're talking about the well-being of children or youth, as a teacher, I can say that I think that well-being starts in the classroom. The teacher has the most access to be helpful to students. But I think the community has a role in that. Can you tell me?
Yes,
what do you
absolutely.
think?
Yeah, and sometimes when you talk about well-being in certain cultures, people think about, oh, this term is very, European or Western, and we don't have well-being. What is it? Or it feels very selfish and individual. But actually realize that well-being is actually rooted in the community, in different community practices. So the idea is, again, how can we take care of each other and of ourselves, right? So definitely teachers share responsibility, but also the school has a responsibility towards the teachers themselves,
Yes,
So it's not that the teachers are there to support the students, but also teachers need to be supported, and we see that very often they're not, right? So it's kind of like all these pieces of the puzzle, and how can they really support each
How can
other
we
so the
connect them? Yes.
ecosystem can thrive.
Gizem, you wanted to add
Yeah, at
something?
that point, I see teachers and psychological counselors as the backbone of the school climate, because during the pandemic, we felt lots of emotions together. They were really complex emotions, negative emotions, positive emotions, and they mixed. All the emotions are normal and necessary for us. And what makes an emotion abnormal is the effect, how much it is harmful to our behaviors or the others and the close friends or close familiar things for us. So I think at that point, yes, well-being of children, well-being of young people is really important, and we're trying to support them. But at the same time, and to the same extent, we should consider the teachers and psychological counselors. And psychological counselors have a similar background to like psychologists or clinical psychologists. Maybe at that period, as Mayavak Foundation we did in our trauma-informed school program, they should be supported some deep supervisions, how they can sustain their negotiations with caregivers, with children, from a technical side. What is this technical side? To be more aware, to be more alert, how is going on with that children, what's going on with that children, at what point they should be alert, and they should feel that, yes, there is something I can do, something important I should do something for that children. So yes, deep supervisions for psychological counselors and well-being sessions, crisis management educations, crisis management trainings for teachers, I think to be considered. But for all the school climate, teachers, psychological counselors, education personnel, and school administration, and I think again caregivers must be supported by the approach. We should learn, we should teach the difference between the acceptance and surrendering. Because during the pandemic, I think this difference, this nuance should be emphasized. Because acceptance is a state of mind that shows us what we should do. As I said before, yes, it shouldn't be perfect, but it's enough and good. Acceptance is a state of mind, is a catalyst, and moderates us, and it manages us in an effective way, in a functional way. But on the other hand, surrendering is a state of mind, is a more passive state of mind that okay, I have no control over my life during pandemic or after pandemic. I can do nothing. But of course, it's not like that. We can discover, and we can effectively manage our all internal resources and external resources during pandemic, both for our well-being and then the others around ourselves.
And I think recipes of well-being are a great resource for people to uplift their well-being and to help others and to basically do better. And just going back to recipes of well-being, someone is asking, have you received feedback on contributing? Has Greta received feedback of people contributing their own recipes of well-being?
Yes. Oh, thank you, whoever asked that question. I think that's what I love, right? Because I mean, if we think about well-being, it's not that I have all the knowledge, right?
Yeah.
Again, well-being, there's no one size fits all. You know, it's contextual. It keeps changing depending on the time we live in. And so from the beginning, our library has been like kind of like a cookbook, and we've had different chefs contributing. So we had people from all around the world, from leaders, from educators, psychologists, facilitators, tribe leaders, who actually share like, this is an activity we have, you know, our practice that I'm sharing. And I think this is what makes it beautiful. Of course, there's many more. So if this person also has, you know, recipes to contribute, we're more than happy to receive them. But also, I think one important thing I wanted to go back to what Gizem was saying about being able to also accept all the emotions, right? So I don't want people to get the wrong idea that we're promoting well-being, therefore you're always happy, you're always strong, you're always resilient, you're always like on it. Actually, the concept we use is the concept of whole being, the idea that we're whole human beings. So yes, there is the well-being, which is on the positive side, again, which is also determined by society, what is positive, who decides what's positive. But also sometimes there's difficult situations. The pandemic, there's difficult emotions, loss, you know, there's trauma. And we shouldn't kind of
Push it.
push them away, but integrate them, because there's a lot of learning out of wisdom. So also when we talk about well-being in education, it's not just about teaching about like, okay, gratitude journaling, amazing, yes, we can do all of this, and appreciation, but also how do you overcome some of the challenges, because shocks and traumas will happen. So it's not about pretending they're not there, but how do you work with them? That's why we talk about well-being plus bed-being, that's how we call it, makes whole being. And I think this is very important, not to have the distorted vision that everything is good, because
it's not.
It's not.
Because bad things will happen.
Exactly.
I don't think anybody expected a pandemic to arise or a lockdown to happen. And I want us to start talking about, okay, what can we do? And Shunta, I would like your input on this, because we've spoken on what we can do as a community. We should support teachers, we should support caregivers, we should support these people. But I want to talk about policies. So Shunta, can you please tell us what can be done in terms of policy?
Thank you very much, Yusra. And my apologies for not being able to join in person. I hope you understand with all the travel restrictions at the moment. It's not the easiest of times. I would love to be there, but hopefully I can still share some insights.
We're happy that you're here.
Through this virtual means. So I just want to maybe first of all just build on what Gizem and Greta have said. The first thing I just want to say actually is that it's really good that we're talking about mental health for all people. One challenge that we face in policy is that when we talk about mental health policy, that discussion is very much directed at people with severe mental health conditions, when in fact we actually all have mental health. It's really important that when we think about mental health, well-being, and I think the well-being discussion is an attempt to broaden what we understand as mental health, right? Yeah. That we think not just of people in the most difficult circumstances, but how do we actually promote better mental health for all? So I think what we need is, in a way, a tiered approach where there's a focus on mental health for everyone, and then there's more targeted interventions at people who might be experiencing clinically significant mental health conditions who would benefit from specialist support, for example. Just briefly on the impact of the pandemic too, I just want to build on what Gizem said. Because Gizem said from her personal experience working with the Maya Foundation, she's seeing people experiencing high levels of mental distress. And this is actually also backed up by data across countries. So we did an evidence scan. We've been doing a continuous evidence scan, in fact, of what's happening to the mental health of people across OECD countries, and what's happening to specific subgroups. And what we actually found that was that in March 2021, prevalence of symptoms of anxiety and depression was about 30% to 80% higher amongst young people compared to the rest of the adult age group. And this isn't actually something that existed prior to the crisis. So a lot of this gap is new. And so there's a specific need actually for us to focus on policy to support young people's mental health. And just briefly, it's not just actually about anxiety and depression alone. Of course, there are a range of mental health conditions, but one thing I want to in particular stress is actually loneliness. Because one of the impacts of the pandemic is that it has cut social connections, networks. Of course, has been discussed today. A lot of this can be replaced through digital means, but not entirely. And so we're seeing loneliness emerge as a public health concern for people of all ages, and especially young people. Whereas previously, it was a discussion that was often consigned to older persons. So I think this is a positive step, and we need to use this momentum in order to create action on mental health. And maybe just before I hand back over, I can actually talk about what does that action actually look like, right? Because I think that's your real question here. So I think what the first and foremost, what we need is greater investment and prioritization of mental health across all ministries. Now, if we're talking about mental health as being something that affects everyone, how we all have mental health, the support for mental health and mental health policies cannot be limited and siloed just to the health system. So we need policies in workplaces, we need policies in the education system, in the social protection system, in welfare services. We need all-around support and an integrated approach to mental health in governments. So maybe I can start with that, and I'm happy to dig into more detail.
Yes, before you do, I just want to add a point, build on what you just said, that it's not just something that one group is going through. Like you said, it's social trauma. And someone from the audience said that well-being is sometimes a gendered concept, where women or young ladies or girls are allowed to be depressed or have anxiety, and it's okay, we'll treat them, we'll help them. But what about young boys, and what about men? I think, like you said, Shunta, the conversation needs to be broader, and it needs to include all groups of people. Sorry, you wanted to say something.
Yeah, maybe I can just jump in on the point on differences between genders, right? I think this is a really important discussion to have. What we've seen is the prevalence of symptoms of the two most common forms of mental health conditions, anxiety and depression, is higher amongst women and young women than young men. But then, for example, in many countries, rates of suicide amongst young people are much higher amongst men than women. And so there's an extent to which there's different levels of stigmatization of mental health, maybe across genders, and maybe also it speaks to the different ways in which mental health issues present themselves across genders. So it's a really important actual discussion to have, right? How do mental health conditions differ between men and women? What does that mean for policy? And so it's really great for raising that question, and something definitely that policymakers should be keeping in mind when they're thinking about young people's mental health.
May I add something? Because I would love to thank the person who commented this. Again, just to remind ourselves that well-being, it is not just individual, right? So there's actually systems that have an impact on our well-being. So gender can have an impact, you know. And again, exactly different structures. So as you know, Shunta was saying, we need to change policies, and we at different levels, right? In the education sector, in the economy, how we work. We really have to reinvent what it means to be together, you know, to thrive together. And until we have that conversation, sometimes I feel that then the individuals feel it's my responsibility to be well. And you can do a lot, you know, you can accept and not surrender and really be active. But also there is a limit. And until the system starts to change, or until we are able to find the right leverages, there's also so much you can do, because everything else is impacted by that. So actually, I'm part of a community of change makers. And we ran a study called The Possibilist, and we interviewed over 800 young change makers from around the world. So these are people, again, leading their initiatives. And we saw that 59% of them actually experience burnout or have experienced some form of burnout. And again, this is higher among women. It is higher between the age of 16 to 20. It is higher among non-binary participants, marginalized communities. So again, issues like race, gender, socioeconomic context, they have an impact. And we have to talk about these things. Otherwise, we're just perpetuating a system which doesn't allow the individual and the community to thrive.
And I think systemic barriers are just as important as trauma, because it's not something that you really control. You don't control being born a certain gender or a certain race or a certain anything. And I do think, like you said, and like Shunta said, that policies need to be put in place. Shunta, can you give us an example of a policy that, if implemented, it would make well-being, mental well-being, more accessible to people and generally better things?
Sure. And I just want to begin by kind of reiterating what Greta said, because so this week actually the OECD we've had this conference on mental health and well-being, and the keynote message, actually the first speaker spoke about the importance of the fact that we actually do know the causes of poor mental health. It's often said we don't really know what's the cause of mental health, poor mental health, but actually all the evidence points to the fact that we need to address the broader social environment. Yeah. So if we're going to promote better mental health for people in disadvantaged circumstances, we need to tackle those disadvantages. We need to recognize that people in disadvantaged circumstances are more likely to report poorer mental health. So these two are really interlinked. And so when we actually talk about mental health policy, that's why we're talking about things like education policy, employment policy. Now that you asked, with regards to, okay, what is a specific policy that we can,
just
we can
an
put
example,
into place?
something like that, yeah.
Sure. And maybe I can focus on schools, because I know that education is really the key focus of this summit. So in Ireland, for example, they have in place what's called it's basically a continuum of care on mental health. What does this actually mean? So basically, the government has set out these guidelines and rules on how schools have to approach well-being and mental health. And what it says is that there are 3 levels of support. The first level of support is support for all students and the entire school environment. It needs to promote well-being and a healthy living. So that's the first thing. Then we need more targeted support at people who might be at risk of developing mental health conditions. That might be, for example, people at risk of dropping out of school. That can often be the first sign of poor mental health further down the line. And then you need very specific targeted interventions at people who might need or benefit from specialist support. And there comes the importance of linking schools and health services and facilitating referrals so that young people experiencing mental health conditions get the support they need. And so actually one concrete thing that governments can do, just to link onto that, is, for example, in the UK, where they actually subsidize schools, or they basically provide a grant to school leaders in order for them to become trained in mental health. Mm-hmm. So the government actually pays for that. So they go back to school and implement a whole of school approach to mental health policy. So these are the kinds of, just one example of what countries can do to promote better mental health for all.
I think your answer just answered a question that was asked. The person asked, how do schools support teachers and staff members that share their personal mental health struggles? Are they supported by school administration? Are there any specific cases you can share? And this is a question to all 3 of you. Do you have any cases where a teacher or a caregiver or someone who's in charge of children, let's say, or the youth, expressed their mental health struggles? How were they received?
Yes.
I'm losing you slightly. I didn't quite catch the entire question, but I think it was about a specific example in a...
Yeah, so the question is about teachers, specifically the person asked, but I'm making the question broader, of someone who's a caregiver to children or youth, someone who's expressed that they are going through mental health struggles. How were they supported or not?
So I can't speak about any specific circumstances, but what often happens, you are right, is that let's say a teacher, for example, is experiencing a mental health issue. and they are also not therefore unable to also look after the mental health of their own students.
Yes.
What happens often here, and there's evidence on this, is that there's high levels of stigmatization towards mental health. So people are unwilling to talk about mental health, unwilling to be open about mental health. So looking at this from a policy angle, the issue here is that we need to change the language with which we talk about mental health. We need to change the attitudes towards mental health. And I think that's why training senior staff in schools, teachers, parents also, as was mentioned there, caregivers, all these actors need to be trained in mental health in some way or
Who do
another.
you think should give
and
this
maybe,
training?
Well, there definitely needs to be government-wide initiatives to promote awareness of mental health issues. You see significant initiatives, often targeting children and young people, like the Time to Change initiative in the UK. So there needs to be that high-level government-wide approach. But then school, it probably is one of the best ways in which to do this. But we shouldn't just assume that schools are able to do this, right? Schools are in a very difficult circumstance right now, especially with COVID and the disruptions to learning. It's actually governments need to make sure there's sufficient support so that schools can provide mental health support and make sure mental health is prioritized in learning and education. That's not just the responsibility of schools themselves or the individuals. That really is the responsibility of policymakers to make sure there's enough investment and support available.
Yes, I definitely agree. I do think that policymakers should have a bigger role in well-being and making sure that mental health issues are being resolved and are being discussed even to begin with. Gizem, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, answering this question, of course, through conducting a mental health and psychosocial support program in Maya Vakıf Foundation, we have lots of cases. The question is there any
example.
case? Yes,
Yeah.
we have lots of cases from children's side, parents' side, caregiver side, and school climate side. Of course, we have many cases. I can give many examples, but the point is that yes, we Maya Vakfı as a non-profit organization provide this service as a during pandemic online psychological support, and we are going into schools in under the of course umbrella of Minister of National Education. We do this. I think the point is that regarding policy, this kind of programs, for example, a trauma-informed approach, trauma-informed perspective should be merged into the curriculum. Yani, of course, we are doing this as a foundation, as Maya Vakfı, as a program, but with time, the aim should be make it as a whole curriculum, all of the schools. As much as possible, of course, with time this happens. But if this happens, the well-being side of teachers, the well-being of school counselors, and the well-being of children spontaneously should be considered and will be considered in the curriculum itself. And I think the trauma-informed approach, trauma-informed means being alert and being aware of what is trauma and in what step, to what extent we should do something about trauma. And I want to focus on important point at that side. And trauma always is considered as a big major life events like harassment, like abuse, like death, like loss. But it's not always the case. Most of the time, not being heard and not being seen as a child is also trauma. So, especially during the pandemic, children, most of the children maybe don't have a chance to be seen and heard. So, we should see this, we should hear this. But regarding gender sides, I want to put something about them. Yes, statistical numbers say something to us, but it's really easy to observe that women had more strength and had to resist in such kind of things during pandemic. At the same time, they want to try their private life. They try to work. They try to regulate their children's emotion. But where is her emotion? But at the same time, they had to do lots of things about their private life, working life. So during our studies, it's really observable that the woman really the most powerful feeling was powerfulness, I can say in a summary.
Yeah, I
yes,
think
the powerfulness was really powerful because uncertainty, unexpectedness, and not knowing what to do, not knowing what it will be like that is really make them feel powerlessness.
I think this goes back to the systemic barriers that you were talking about, Greta, because women in this context are expected to hold the home life and then lead their own lives and things like that. A great question came up, and I would like to ask all three of you. Someone said that it's great to see the shift in policymakers prioritizing the integration of student well-being policies across school systems. However, as the next step forward, how can we measure that policies are truly effective? Any specific key performance indicators? Something that measures that the policy is working. So if we, for example, integrate something in the curriculum to make well-being at the forefront of conversation, something that truly is a part of reform, how can we measure the result? How can we say, yes, that policy worked?
I mean, I guess maybe Shunta here is the best person, but because I'm not into policies and, that's not my expertise. But I think, again, maybe I would question a little bit the idea that one intervention will directly lead to a result. The world is much more complex than that. The impact of an action, there is some expected impact, unexpected, positive, negative. So I would say that we should see that society improves as a whole, right? So that we can feel that the community is thriving, the society is thriving, that we are in a more harmonious relationship with ourselves, with other people. So violence will decrease, the ecological collapse that we're facing. So for me, it would really be a transformation of society, and that's I don't think we need a KPI, but we would just feel it. I don't know. Maybe I'm a little bit on the philosophical end, so I'll let you, Shunta, say the KPIs.
Thanks, Greta. I think that's a huge question. I mean, one of the biggest challenges with mental health is that we don't have the data to begin with, actually. We don't really have that much data on what is the state of young people's mental health, say, across OECD countries or even in specific countries. The data there's quite patchy. It's not regularly monitored. Thankfully, actually, COVID has resulted in a huge amount of new attention placed on data collection on mental health. And that's why I can sit here and say, look, young people's mental health has been particularly affected. But I think from a policy perspective, when we take a macro approach, it is necessary, first of all, that we actually have this data. I'm not saying that we can't do it without the data, we can't make changes, but that has to be the bedrock of any policy change we implement. At the OECD, for example, we do have a question on relating to student well-being and mental health in the Program for International Student Assessment, quite a well-known assessment that the OECD runs. My colleagues in the Education Directorate run that. So, through this data, we can see, for example, that young people with mental health conditions are, I think it was 35% more likely to repeat a grade, right? 15-year-olds, this is. So we do have some evidence on the side of how much is the gap. I think a lot more evidence clearly needs to be collected on what actual interventions work. But there are definitely some promising initiatives. Clearly, training grants or incentives for schools to actually train their staff in mental health. That's clearly going to have an impact, but it's very hard to calculate because the impacts are very diffuse. So I'll leave it at that. If anyone has any set of great initiatives that are fully evidence-based, where all the data supports the implementation of specific measures, like a package of measures at schools, that would be great to hear, and something I'm very open to learning more about.
Yeah, just to echo on what both of you said, I don't think, I don't believe that reform or policy changing or something like that should be focused on the end result so much, but on the process. So of people getting better, actually, people's well-being being treated, people getting clinical help. I think that's more important than, okay, so now we're better. How can we ensure? How can we measure that we're perfect now?
Yeah. For measurement, I want to add something. Yes, the numbers, the application numbers, the statistics will show us lots of things. Yes, and it's needed, I think. But it brings us to a different topic, different issue, because I think mental health and well-being concepts will never end. Because how can I say, when a children came to me, or when a caregiver came to me, this doesn't mean he or she has a mental health disorder. This doesn't mean it is a mental health classification. I can't say this, because I think this is stigmatization. Yes, there are some names, there are some disorder names about what they feel, what they do, or what they tackles with, but this doesn't mean that they have a disorder. Yes, this is a spectrum. We have some patterns, we have some tendencies, and sometimes the life is difficult for us. And sometimes some things triggers this. For example, pandemic. For example, pandemic may triggers me from a anxiety side, but maybe you are triggered by and for your anger management side. And so mental health and well-being issue is a really big concept and will never end, because from a clinical perspective, I can say supporting with a clinical psychologist under the heading of mental health and psychosocial support doesn't mean that you had a pathology. All of us had a pathology. Just the ratios are different.
Just the
we have
ratios are
some
different.
tendencies. We are human. We have our difficulties. We have some vulnerabilities. And I think our vulnerabilities is our power. Because when we discover our vulnerabilities and tendencies, we get more powerful, I think. Clinical process, being with a therapist, conducting a therapeutic process with a therapist means you discover yourself. You know more yourself, and you want to, if you want to know more about yourself, the way the process will be easier. I mean.
And that's why it's really
And I-
difficult to have KPIs, right? We actually need, in terms of policy, we need policy to move away maybe from KPIs to understand that we need more complex systemic approaches, which will never be ending. So yes, you can take a snapshot, but because your environment is constantly changing, your ecosystem is getting stimuli from everywhere, it's really hard to say, you know, any action will then lead to other things. So you always need to be able to sense, to adapt, to grow. And I think that's why also well-being is a lifelong journey for individuals, for communities, for society. It's not something you can be like, okay, we've achieved it. What does it mean? Like work-life balance,
What
like
is
that
it?
balance. It's not there. You're always constantly sensing and adapting. I think this is the true power. And unfortunately, it is really difficult to do at a societal level, policy level. But maybe that's also the evolution of policy, you know, rather than keep doing the same things that maybe don't serve the purpose.
Definitely.
Totally agree.
Yes, totally agree. Shunti, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just want to jump in, and I think when I use the word mental health, I'm very careful on what words I use, right? The reason why I use the word mental health condition, often to refer to people with clinically significant mental health issues, is that to not stigmatize them, right? And so actually, even if people are above a certain clinical threshold and say they're diagnosed as having depression, that doesn't actually mean in most cases that means they can still go to work. That means they can still study with the right support. So I think it's important also when we talk about mental health that we overcome this stigma, right? Because too often, actually, one big issue that we see in policy is that mental health policy is often framed simply under, say, disability policy, when in fact it's not the same, right? And it's not tapping into a lot of people with mental health conditions and a lot of people experiencing high levels of mental distress. I fully agree, I think, with what our other speakers are saying about how we need policymakers to think more broadly, right, about well-being, and that's what a lot of governments are doing. That I guess the challenge there is how do you look at high-level numbers on what's happening to well-being to the population against what policies are being implemented. So I think policymakers are going towards that direction, but it is very difficult to measure.
I think because it is difficult to measure, that's why policymakers are having a hard time implementing these policies. And I think that people love seeing instant results. And with mental well-being, you really cannot see immediate result. You have to wait it out. You have to figure out yourself. You have to figure out your environment, what happened in the past, what's going to happen. It's a lot of work that cannot be immediately shown. I would just like to thank all three of you. Unfortunately, our panel is coming to an end.
We see the results of the polls. I'll be
I
interested to
did
see them.
not receive it. And Valerie, if you could, because the question was, how are you feeling right now, I think. But I don't have the results.
Okay.
So I'm actually interested in seeing it too.
Yes.
If we can get that. No? Yes?
But whatever the results, I can cover like that. For example, and life goes on. We are here. We are all here.
Yeah.
But during the pandemic goes on, we are here. It doesn't mean that we have no problems.
Yeah.
We have some problems. The problems will be
There will always be
to
there.
some extent.
Yeah.
But the point is that to try to be fully functioning in daily life,
Yes.
well-being.
I think so. Now I'm just waiting for the results of the poll. Maybe perhaps I can check them out.
That's okay. I just, wanted
I'm
to...
interested too because ever since with the lockdown and with the pandemic, feelings now mean more to me. And the words I choose are more important. Okay, I got them, sorry.
Oh.
So the question was, how would you range your current mental health status? Not sure, poor, excellent, average, somewhat poor, somewhat good. The highest answer was somewhat good.
Okay.
Most people feel somewhat good. That makes me happy. Yeah.
Yeah.
That makes me happy that people feel somewhat good. And the one right above it is somewhat poor.
Okay.
So people are having this equilibrium, this middle status. But yeah, thank you so much, all three of you. It was a privileging moment to be discussing this with you. And you can find all three of them on social medias, on websites, on everything. If you need anything, just ask me or ask them.
Yeah.
And thank you everybody for listening.
Thank you
Thank
for
you.
hosting us. Thank you, everyone. And stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shunta.